Good evening, everyone.
I never did hear about that.
How lovely that you're here in this air conditioning instead of outside sweltering. I am happy I am here. My name's Betty Ferris, and I'm on the board of the Washburn Area Historical Society, which in collaboration with the Washburn Heritage Association sponsoring this 5th annual Tony Woyak Festival. And I'm sure all of you will agree, those of you who knew Tony, that I think you would be just thrilled that this is still ongoing and that it's drawing the community together to listen to these wonderful stories. It's made possible this evening in part by a grant from the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy. Music this evening is provided by the gorgeous and gifted Lisa Wilson. And is sponsored by Catherine and Don Ekstrom in memory of Rosalie Fortier Thompson, Washburn High School class of 1937. And please stay afterwards and enjoy some more of Liesel's fantastic playing. She gifted us earlier with some of the fiddle tunes that probably were played in the lighthouses and definitely in this area, definitely from the traditional strain, so that was pretty cool. And thanks to the Steak Pit. We really appreciate your hospitality. And join us on August 2nd to hear Karen Novacek talk about the Robinson family. Now, our speaker this evening, many of you already know, is Bob Makrith. He's been an important part of this history festival since its inception. Bob spent a long career with the National Park Service, living and working in environments ranging from the Atlantic shoreline to California's Sierra Nevada. He and his wife Susan came to northern Wisconsin in 1992 and realized that this was the place to stay. You may have seen some gigantic black and brown Newfoundlands driving around in various places and on the beach, and they may or may not, but probably did and do belong to Bob and Sue. So anyway, after many years as a field ranger, Bob's final assignment was as park historian of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. After he retired from the lakeshore in 2005, Bob helped organize the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing together diverse groups, including community citizens, tribal members, and the historic families of the Apostle Islands, in a spirit of mutual cooperation to help preserve the historic heritage of northern Wisconsin. The Conservancy celebrated its 10th anniversary this year. That's awesome. And has amassed a proud record of accomplishments, including, among other things, sponsorship of this lecture series. So Bob and his colleagues in the Conservancy are looking forward to even greater things in the next 10 years, and we are looking forward to cooperating and collaborating with them. So, Bob Makrith.
Thank you so much, Betty. I very much appreciate the opportunity to get up here. And I am always pleased to look out and see so many familiar faces at these presentations. The fact that after seeing one of my programs, you actually come back for another tells me that I'm not as bad as it might be. The other thing is, I just want to give a shout out to Liesl for the incredible music that we've been enjoying. And offer a personal recollection, which I hope won't embarrass Liesl too much, is that this is actually the second performance of hers that I have managed to catch. The first one was a really intimate venue, a really nice little show. The entire audience was me and a dog with a face full of porcupine quills. Her mom is our veterinarian, and Liesl was a lot younger then. It's about 20 years ago. The fiddle was smaller, but it's quite clear that her talent is been huge from the get-go, and it's a real privilege to share the stage with someone as talented as Liesl. She has her own webpage, I learned, lieslwilson.com, is that correct?
That is correct.
And I know I will be heading straight for it when I get home, and I hope some of you folks do too. And you'll be continuing to play after my kid? Wonderful. So there's more good music coming tonight to make up for my program. Let's see. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Well, as I say, I look at it and I see a lot of familiar faces. I know a number of you have been to some of my earlier presentations on things like Tom Blake and the great surfing champion from Washburn, the history of the DuPont plant at Barksdale, the men from Washburn who went up to dig for gold in the Klondike in the late 1800s. I've really enjoyed putting together those programs. Typically what I'll do is I'll find a subject and say, let me come up with a subject to talk about in my next presentation, and I'll do the research on a particular place or event or a person and then research it and put on the program. This one is a little different. I'm kind of concentrating right now on my core mission, which is for a long time been researching the history of the Apostle Islands lighthouses. People have always said, Bob, are you going to do a book on that? And I keep saying, one of these days. In fact, what I have been doing all along is writing and posting it on my website. I like to think I'm enough with the times that rather than necessarily committing everything to print on dead tree matter, I like to put it online where people can get at it any time, day or night. Because someday it'll probably all end up between the binders of a book. But if that happens, then that's fine for the couple hundred people who might buy it. But meanwhile, anybody who wants to anywhere in the world can, if they're interested in the Apostle Islands lighthouses, already has access to the material. And what I thought I'd do tonight is just, since basically I'm looking out and seeing old friends at this point, is share some of the stories, some of my favorite stories that I've amassed over the years. And on a night like this, where you look out and the lake is just glass calm, it's a beautiful night. I'm very appreciative of everybody coming out when there's so many other things to be done in this part of the world. I'm going to take you guys to a really nasty night in September of 1887, when the keeper of the Raspberry Island Lighthouse found himself marooned on Oak Island, a place where he very much did not want to be. Cold, wet, and hungry, huddled in a damp sail for the warmth he could offer, Francis Yocker pondered what might happen to his body once he succumbed, as it seemed he surely would, to exposure. Would it be quickly eaten by a wolf or a bear, or picked apart a bit at a time by hungry crows? Or would someone find his remains while there was still enough of him left to bury? For the 10th time, maybe the 100th, he'd lost count, he searched his trouser pockets for a match. Just one match. All it would take to give him hope for life. He allowed himself to dream, to picture the dry grass and twigs that he'd collect, the careful way he would shelter the precious match as he struck it, and how zealously he would have fanned the flames as they arose. Just one match would be enough to give him a chance for survival. But once again, there was no match to be found. Yocker marched up and down the beach, flailing his arms about to keep the blood flowing. At least his feet were covered now. That first morning, the cold sand burned his bare feet painfully as he paced back and forth in the rain. How lucky he felt to find one old boot in the shoreline debris and enough twine to bind a shred of the sail around his other foot. He probably would not lie rotting on the sand forever, Yocker decided. It wouldn't take long for some ship's captain to notice that his lighthouse had gone dark and raise an alarm. Someone would hurry out to Raspberry Island to see what was going on, and they'd figure things out quickly enough. The empty lamp, the clockwork weights lying loose at the bottom of their shaft, a half-eaten loaf of bread sitting on the kitchen table, and they'd put two and two together. They'd hurry down the trail to the boathouse, and finding it empty, the answer would be plain. The Raspberry Island keeper had gone missing on the lake. Searchers would fan out to the other islands, mariners would be told to keep a lookout, and before long, the splintered timbers of his boat on Oak Island's empty shore would point the way to Francis Yocker's resting place. Well, Francis is not going anywhere, so I want to take a moment and talk to you a little more about what I plan to do tonight. We'll come back now and then to see how we check in on how Francis is doing. As I said, tonight I'm just going to share some of the stories that I've come up with. I kind of looked and said, what story should I tell tonight? Did some cherry picking a few days ago. And I'm going to talk, I decided among other things to talk about decisions that people made. The good decisions, the bad decisions, and what were the ramifications in the long-term way of things. I'm going to be telling a lot of things about people who screwed up, okay? That's always where the funny parts come, right? I'm going to talk about a couple of mysteries, and I'm going to talk about some of the unusual or intriguing supporting characters who turn up in the story of the lighthouses of the Apostle Islands. And in terms of mysteries, as I say, sometimes doing history is like a detective story. For instance, maybe a lot of you have heard through the interpretive programs or whatever that the very first lighthouse in the Apostle Islands, the Michigan Island Lighthouse, built in 1856, was put on the wrong island. And that, in fact, is true. But what took a long, long time to figure out is how in the world that ever happened. Now, the earliest discussions of a site for the beacon are found in the records of the U.S. Lighthouse Board. In 1852, the board made plans for several new lighthouses in the country along the wild Northwest Lakes, as the Great Lakes were then called. For once, it seemed the agency was showing foresight. The locks at Sault Ste. Marie would not open Lake Superior to large vessels for another 3 years. Much of the surrounding territory was still Indian land. It was not until 1854 that the Treaty of La Pointe opened the floodgates to white settlement. Among the proposed lights was a marker for the harbor at La Pointe on Madeline Island. Even in decline, the old fur trade post remained a key spot on Lake Superior. The first thought was to put a tower near the village itself, but after looking over the charts, Captain Lorenzo Sitgraves, lighthouse superintendent in charge, apparently discerned that a light there would be no help to vessels approaching from the open lake. Instead, a second plan spotted the lighthouse for better visibility on a nearby strip of land known variously as Long Island or Chequamegon Point. And now as a digression, Lorenzo Sitgraves, one of the first of the interesting little supporting characters that come up in our story, hardly a small character. In fact, Lorenzo Sitgraves, before he became an administrator with the Lighthouse Bureau, was a fairly important explorer of the American Southwest. In his younger days as a captain with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he led an expedition into the American Southwest, and today there is a Mount Sitgraves named after him in Arizona, and even the Sitgraves National Forest is named after this guy, who also happens to be the guy who picked out the location for the first Apostle Islands Lighthouse. That much settled, in July 1854, the plans were set and the contracts were let. Sitgraves dispatched a representative with a clear mandate. Mr. Abraham Smoke is authorized to point out the sites of the lighthouses and superintend their construction. in midsummer 1856, a year behind schedule, Smoke accompanied a crew from the construction firm of Sweet, Ransom, and Shin to the Apostle Islands, and the yarn grows tangled from there. In October, the workmen left behind a lighthouse not on Long Island, but on Michigan Island, 17 miles away. Why? This question remained baffling for years. In 1988, one of the first researchers to examine the riddle wrote, "All we can do is speculate. What makes such confusion hard to understand is that La Pointe was a substantial town at the time. It may never be known what happened to cause the mistake." 4 years later, another study offered a confident explanation. Incredibly, records and inference combined to show that the contractor hired to build the La Pointe Light put it on the wrong island by mistake. Reading the historical clues carefully makes it difficult to agree with the latter contention. However, they explain why answers were easy to miss for so long. Detectives are rarely so lucky as to find a mountain of evidence like the one that eventually built up on Michigan Island. Documents unearthed over the years demonstrate pretty conclusively that the government official Abraham Smoke made the decision to place the lighthouse at a different location from the one planned, and leaves some tantalizing clues as to what his thought process might have been. But they also include a couple of red herrings that obscured the trail for quite a while. After the job was finished, the contractors, feeling cheated by the government, addressed a lengthy protest to the Treasury Department, seeking to recoup extra costs incurred by the change in plans. Included in a massive package of documentation was a "cover your butt" letter contractor Allenson Sweet wrote to Abraham Smoke, dated August 1, 1856, before beginning work on the lighthouse. "As the representative of the contractors for the building of a lighthouse at La Pointe Harbor, Lake Superior, I will state to you that we will go on and build the lighthouse on Passage Island, Lake Superior, as you have located or may locate it hereafter, under your direction. But we do not waive any rights by so doing that we may have under our contract for building a lighthouse at La Pointe." Now here we see both explanation and ambiguity. Clearly, Mr. Sweet was reluctant to build a tower at a spot different from the one previously arranged. And here's one of those red herrings, though. The Passage Island we know today is far across Lake Superior with its own lighthouse. Might uncertainty about the island's name have been a cause of error? Almost certainly not. Passage Island was an alternate name for Michigan Island at the time. Lighthouse Board documents used the names interchangeably as late as 1871. Reaching for an explanation, a 1992 study speculates the government's representative in Bayfield, lacking clear orders himself, apparently directed the contractor to proceed with construction on Michigan Island. That hardly seems possible. Lorenzo Sitgraves was an experienced explorer himself. Among many accomplishments, he was the first Euro-American to visit the petrified forest and the ancient Pueblo site now preserved as Wupatki National Monument. To suggest that he would neglect to provide his representative detailed instructions beggars belief. So what might Government Representative Abraham Smoke been thinking to change the terms of the agreement? One hypothesis comes to mind. Michigan Island was not the only place where Smoke changed plans on the fly. Among 11 lighthouses ordered in the contract, he shifted the site for 3. The additional expense peeved the contractors no end, and they took time to complain in detail. By the direction of a government agent and under our protest, the lighthouse was constructed at its present location and at a vast increase in expense. At La Pointe, there was a good harbor, and the buildings must have been constructed but a few feet above the level of the lake. While at the point where it was constructed, building materials had to be hoisted up a perpendicular cliff 110 feet high. In two of Smoke's three change orders, the so-called Passage Island Light and the Grand Island Light, the lamp moved from the shoreline to the top of a bluff. Could it be that Abraham Smoke decided that a light on top of a cliff would be visible a greater distance, and thus better? That we probably will never know. Smoke left some records, but not a word of explanation on this topic, though he lived to be 100 years old. Whatever Smoke's reasoning, the consequences of his unilateral decision were grave. After only 1 year of operation, the lighthouse was shuttered, supplanted by a replacement hastily constructed on Long Island, the site originally specified. It is clear that someone, presumably superiors in Washington, overruled Smoke after the fact. Many sources claim that Sweet, Smith, and Ransom were directed to build this new light at their own expense, but this has not been proven so far and actually seems questionable. Their detailed screed, itemizing every penny spent beyond the initial agreement, makes no mention of an entire extra lighthouse. Here's another mystery yet to be solved. The beacon on Michigan Island was relit a decade later to shine until the present. Even so, the light remained in the wrong place in one important respect. At the island's southern point, it did a miserable job of warning mariners of the hazards nearby clustered at the north end. It became a standing joke that to see the Michigan Island light, you have to run over Gull Island first. A virtual fleet of ships grounded off the island before the 1929 erection of a taller tower. Just one more long-term effect of Abraham Smoke's bad decision. Why don't we go back to Oak Island and see what Francis Yocker is doing? Yeah, it still looks pretty bad. Still there. Yocker's predicament was the result of several decisions, some of his own, some by the U.S. Lighthouse Service. One of them was the location of the station's boathouse a mile away from the lighthouse. Here's a photo taken just a few years later. Imagine that scene there, the old-style Raspberry Island Lighthouse before it was enlarged in 1906, staircase and dock. The boathouse that you see in this picture was not there at the time of the incident. Constructed in 1862 to mark the western channel to the port of Bayfield, the Raspberry Island Lighthouse stood atop a steep bluff overlooking the open lake. By Yocker's time, there was a small dock at the foot of the cliff below the lighthouse. Fully exposed to the open lake, the structure offered no shelter when northwest winds whipped up the waves, a common occurrence in late summer and fall. Rather than building a more substantial dock that would provide all-weather protection, the Lighthouse Service erected a small boathouse on the sheltered eastern side of the island, reached from the lighthouse by a trail through the forest. This arrangement saved on construction costs at the price of operational efficiency. It proved especially frustrating to Yocker, who had made an arrangement with a friendly steamer captain to deliver mail and newspapers as he passed the island. The boat could not take time to stop, but the captain would blow his whistle and toss the precious package overboard in a sturdy leather bag. If things went well, it would float to shore. Otherwise, the lighthouse keeper had a brief window of opportunity to go out and retrieve it himself before it grew waterlogged and sank. If that were not incentive enough to leave the boat at the readily accessible dock, moving the vessel in and out of the boathouse was no simple matter. The structure had originally been equipped with a trackway and winch to ease the task of shifting the boat, but by Yocker's time, they were in disrepair. He attempted to rig a replacement system, but reported that the first storm that came along afterward took it out. Frustrated, he lamented, "Anyone who has had experience on handling a boat and judge what it means to float a two-masted vessel alone and without other means than those at my disposal. Now, the word alone points to another Lighthouse service cost-cutting decision. Through most of their history, the Apostle Islands lighthouses were usually manned by a head keeper and one or even two assistants. However, in 1882, the agency abolished the assistant keeper positions at several of the stations. In response, some experienced keepers quit their jobs rather than accept the additional burden for no additional pay. Yacher, however, willingly accepted the solo position when he began his lighthouse career 4 years later. With no apparent experience, but plenty of influential friends to help him get the job, he arrived at the station in May 1886. Unusually, he chose to come alone. While keepers who were not assigned assistants typically brought their wives and families for company and help with chores, Yacher's large family remained at their Upper Peninsula farm more than 100 miles away. A scholarly sort, Yacher seemed to have responded well to the solitude, despite occasional bouts of loneliness, but he came to recognize a serious downside. Eventually, he sat down and wrote a letter to his superiors requesting more help. The reinstitution of an assistant keeper for this station is deemed necessary by the present writer. In case of an emergency, no assistance is available on the island, and the proper surveillance of the apparatus during the long nights of the fall when dark is exhausting. His plea went ignored, at least at first. On the night of September 12th, 1887, this sequence of decisions bit Yacher in the butt. And now, I'm going to let the lighthouse keeper speak for himself. One of the fascinating things about Francis Yacher, when I say he was a scholarly sort, I really mean it. The guy was a legitimate scholar of Ojibwe folklore, published articles on the topic. He was a talented artist and musician, fascinating guy. And he was also a very vivid writer, and he left quite an account of his ordeal. After I had attended to the duties of my office and lighted my light, I found that I had little desire to bring the boat to its place and to undertake the tiresome work of rowing. It was a splendid evening. The wind had completely died down, and there didn't seem to be the least danger of a storm breaking out in the night. I fastened the boat to the dock. Then I ate a quickly prepared supper, a cup of coffee with freshly baked biscuits, and then lay down to read about midnight. 2 hours later, a roaring noise awakened me. I sprang out of bed to the window. Out of the dark gleamed the white caps of the violent waves and the foam which seethed on the shore. Involuntarily, I shuddered. I saw that it was high time, perhaps too late, to save the boat. I quickly slipped into my trousers. Coat, vest, stockings, or shoes were not to be thought of under the circumstances, and hurried out. The full violence of the storm was now revealed for the first time. The roaring of the waves became rolling thunder, and it cost great effort to reach the balustrade which led me down the steps to the dock. Already the waves were whipping over the boards, and a shower of spray was falling into the wildly pitching boat, which was now rising high, now sinking into the depths. The masts were creaking as if every minute they would be taken off their hinges. Now it was a question of finding the right moment to jump into the boat. Now it pitched on the crest of a wave, and now it was on the point of descending, and then I was jumping and landed on the deck. And then everything went splendidly. After I hoisted the foresail, which had been furled to the last reef, I sprung to the stern and, fighting against storm and waves, began to draw fathom and fathom of the chain on board until the anchor was loosened from the bottom with a sudden jerk. And before I had pulled the ladder on board, and while I was managing the helm with my knees, my little boat was driven forward by the sails and fortunately outside the reach of the seething waves. Now in deeper water, I could quietly steer toward my destination. This is what is known as overconfidence. I was already counting myself lucky that all had gone so well when I noticed to my surprise, as soon as the dark outlines of the shore shone forth more clearly, that the boathouse lay directly behind me and that I had gone around the sheltering point. What happened was he went too far. He was just blown by the wind and the storms, and before he realized that he was too far gone to tack back against the stormy wind. So basically what happened, he threw out an anchor and sat there pitching to and fro all night, wearing nothing but a pair of pants and nothing else, freezing, buffeted about in the dark. And finally the sun comes up and he makes another decision. He's not going to sit there any longer. What he decides to do is pull up the anchor again and head to Oak Island, pull up on his boat on the beach there, and just wait out the storm there. It seemed like a fine idea at the time. However, a day passed, sitting there again, no food, basically in his jammies, and the storm does not die down, and he realizes he's going to be there for a while. As I say, he moved up and down the beach, started looking around. He felt really good when he found this one boot that he could put on. And then he walked around a little bit more, found some twine that he could wrap a little shred of the sail around his other foot, and now he had something on his feet at least, and he's wrapping himself in the damp sail to try and keep warm, sitting there hungry and absolutely jonesing for a smoke. And then the sun goes down, and he realizes he's going to be there another night. He spent another miserable night, and the sun came up, and then things got bad. When I stepped to the edge of the shore to scoop up water within a tin box, I perceived to my astonishment that the wind had veered to the north and the safety of my boat was in danger. It was already being shaken by the waves, so it struck the sand with a grating sound. I had not the strength to pull it further on shore, but I succeeded in anchoring it in deeper water. The only result of the attempt was that I was wet to the skin. As long as the anchor held, of course the boat could not run aground, but on a shallow shore it would soon be filled with water from the swelling waves and become submerged with sand. And so it happened. Silently and helpless, I had to witness how the sea, rising still higher and higher, selected my poor boat for a plaything, so that it rolled groaning heavily on the sand and was filled with sand until its seams opened, and I had to give up all hopes of ever being able to use it for my rescue. So now he's not just up the creek without a paddle, he doesn't even have a boat. Night came again, and still the storm raged. My abandonment was unlimited. The consciousness that with the loss of my boat, all rescue was cut off was disheartening. I could easily bear the want of fire and nourishment if only my boat, my last hope, had survived. I thought of wife and children, of friends and acquaintances, and how easy it would be for them to help me, and how they would hasten to my relief, but they knew nothing of my distress. Yesterday, when I lay down shivering and hungry, as I did today, the prospect of being able to return home as soon as the storm ceased raging comforted me. What could help me now when the wind and waves subsided? The idea of building a raft and crossing the canal, which was 2 miles wide, and favorable weather came to my mind, but gave little encouragement. Yes, if I only had an axe. Well, on the morning of the third day, Yaker finally makes one really smart decision. Rather than remain sitting where he is on the north side of the island, which only faces out toward more islands, he decides to make his way through the woods to the south side of the island, across from the mainland, where if there's any boat traffic at all, that's where it's going to be. Now, Oak Island, anybody ever been out there? Maybe hiked Oak Island? All right. Oak Island is a pretty rugged island, and walking through the woods up and down the ravines is rough enough when you have two shoes on. But finally he gets there, and very quickly his decision pays off. As my eyes looked out upon the water, they were suddenly arrested halfway between the lighthouse and the opposite mainland by a dark spot which seemed to be moving in the direction of the latter. A boat? It could hardly be otherwise. And yet, as it appeared upon the waves, the figure of a man could be plainly seen. A great excitement hung over me. I threw my pack from my back, unrolled the sail, and hung it on a bough so that it fluttered gaily in the wind and could not fail to attract the attention of the boatman. But would he see my signal and turn his course from my direction? In feverish excitement, my eyes fastened to the spot and waited in expectation until it seemed to me that the boat was turning around and coming toward me. And then as this became full reality to me, it seemed as though a stone were rolled from my heart. And I fell to the earth, overpowered by my feelings, and began to pray amid tears and sobs, "Our Father, who art in heaven." A more heartfelt and devout prayer of thanksgiving was never raised to heaven. Well, what happened? Well, you know what happened? While Francis Yocker was out there starving and freezing and wishing at the very least he had a match to build a fire and maybe some tobacco for his pipe, by absolute chance, his wife at the farm 100 miles away got with her two older sons, and let's go surprise Papa with a visit. And Mrs. Yocker and her two sons made it all the way on the rugged roads of the time, 100 miles, to Redcliffe, where they were able to get someone to ferry them across to Raspberry Island. I should point out, by the way, that Mrs. Yocker was an Ojibwe herself. Francis Yocker married an Ojibwe woman, and his whole family of, I think, 7 kids spoke English, German, and Ojibwe at home. So it was very easy for her to get a ride across there at Redcliffe to Raspberry Island. She got there, found the lighthouse deserted, found the lamp out, and the very first thing she did was light the light. That's the sense of duty she had. And the sons went back and started organizing a search party, and then that's how eventually somebody came out and looked for him. That is the incredible coincidence that saved Francis Yocker's life that day in September of 1887. We'll come back to Francis because there's an epilogue too to his story, and a few more decisions to talk about. But I want to move across the archipelago now. Jerry, are you around? Before the program, I was talking to the gentleman from the restaurant here. He was saying he was out off Outer Island just a few days ago, and that's where we're heading now, out to the Outermost Lighthouse of the Apostles. Those of you who are familiar with the islands may notice that there are 6 light stations in the islands, and they are kind of like an inner ring and an outer ring. The inner ring are the ones that were built before the Civil War on Michigan, Long, and Raspberry Islands, and their function, their purpose, was to guide traffic through and among the Apostle Islands to the ports of Bayfield and La Pointe, later on Ashland. And then a second group of lighthouses were built after the Civil War, and their function is to guide ships past the Apostle Islands. Hi. Yeah, okay, we're on our way to Duluth. And the story of how that happened reveals some interesting decisions and some major chicanery along the way. I want to take a close look at the in particular at the Outer Island Lighthouse. To place it where it is. The construction of a lighthouse at the northern tip of the outermost Apostle Island represented a substantial shift in sighting philosophy. The first 3 Apostles' lights had been located to guide ships through the archipelago. Now one would be built to guide traffic past the island chain. The lights on Michigan and Long Island served to direct ships heading for the venerable settlement of La Point, while the Raspberry Island Lighthouse was built to mark the passage to the new port of Bayfield. In contrast, the Outer Island Tower would shine its beam toward the open lake, lighting the way for ships traveling directly from the Sioux Locks to the ports of Duluth and Superior at the lake's west end. Duluth, Superior, Bayfield, and Ashland had all been founded within a 3-year period in the mid-1850s, and for a time it seemed an open question which would gain preeminence as the dominant port of western Lake Superior. The commercial decline of La Point appeared certain. Its island location might have served well enough for a wilderness trading post, but ruled it out as a serious contender in an industrial age. The future lay with a port that could connect to the nation's expanding railroad network. In March 1868, the Wisconsin State Legislature presented a petition to the U.S. Senate seeking the construction of a lighthouse that would serve the interest of Wisconsin's westernmost Lake Superior port. We most respectfully ask for the location of a lighthouse on Outer Island, Lake Superior. This island is the easternmost of a dangerous group of islands lying off a point right on the course of vessels bound in and out of the important and much frequented harbor of Superior. Instructions to assess this request were duly forwarded to T.H. Stevens, inspector in the 11th District. In his replies, Stevens disputed the petitioner's view of the importance of the port of Superior. As the whole number of vessels arriving at Superior City in the present season was less than 25 vessels of all descriptions, I do not consider an addition to the number of the lights already established in this portion of the lake as required. There was no pressing need, he concluded, for a light on Outer Island. Stevens did leave the door open in case of changing conditions. When the channels of commerce are established in the country better developed, a light at this point would be of value to vessels bound outside of the Apostles directly to the lower and western ends of the lake. In just 3 years, it seemed that the Lighthouse Board had concluded that the change had already come. The Lighthouse's annual report for 1871 contains this recommendation: the through commerce to and from the western end of Lake Superior, increasing so rapidly as railroads having termini at Duluth are extended westward, all passes outside of the Apostle Islands and is greatly in need of a lighthouse on the northern end of Outer Island. In February 1873, a respected voice was added to the chorus. Major Orlando M. Poe of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wrote, "The proposed light on Outer Island is of importance to all that portion of the through commerce of Lake Superior passing to or from the westward of the Apostle Islands, that is to say, the commerce of Duluth and Superior City." Now, Orlando Poe is another one of these characters who pop up, and it turns out he's got quite a career outside of the lighthouse business. Orlando Poe, officer with the Army Corps of Engineers, is responsible for many of the lighthouses and harbors and other navigational works on Lake Superior. He's got about a half a dozen lighthouses to his credit that he designed. They're all twins or siblings of the Outer Island Lighthouse. He designed and improved greatly the locks at Sault Ste. Marie. Currently, the largest lock at the Sault is named after him, the Poe Lock. But Another footnote in history is that during the Civil War, he was General Sherman's engineering chief. And in fact, he was the guy who was in charge of the destruction of Atlanta. So when you watch Gone with the Wind and you see that scene of Scarlet and Red in the buggy with the city burning down around him, this is the dude who actually lit the match. He's the same guy who built the Outer Island Lighthouse. So, yeah, and less than 10 days after the date of Poe's letter, Congress appropriated funds for the construction of a lighthouse on Outer Island. So far, so good, right? Construction of the Outer Island Lighthouse began on Friday, July 18th, 1873, the Ashland Press reported, when the steamer Rocket landed a crew of 20 men with 30,000 board feet of lumber and provisions for 3 months. The news account gave no details on the makeup of the crew, but it appears, as in the case of the LaPointe Light, the lighthouse service was represented by a junior-level official. It also appears that this unnamed functionary was quickly subjected to pressure to commit a similar blunder to that made by Abraham Smoke at Michigan Island. Communications between the Apostle Islands and Detroit were still slow, so it took some time for word to reach Major Godfrey Weitzel, recently appointed successor to Orlando Poe as superintendent of the Lighthouse District, that the crew was busily building the new lighthouse in the wrong spot. He recalled, as soon as communication could be had with the parties, it was found that the foreman, in disobedience of his orders, had started the construction on land owned by private parties near the reservation. An older and more experienced foreman was sent without delay, and he planted the stake for the station at the proper place. Unfortunately, the older and more experienced man was then sent to oversee work at another construction site, and it appears that the Outer Island project was turned back to the original foreman. It is clear that as soon as the senior foreman left the area, the workers once again came under pressure to disregard orders and move the site of the lighthouse. What in the world is going on? Well, that's one of the things where the more you dig, the more you find out. Turns out a couple guys named James Knight and John Chapman were behind all of this. They were both prominent citizens of the area, and in fact, Mr. Knight was an official with the U.S. Land Office, which is in charge of doling out, selling off, and otherwise managing the government land holdings in the area. And somehow, this gentleman who had inside information on all the land dealings in the area went and with his partner, 4 years before the lighthouse was built, snapped up the tract of land at the northern tip of Outer Island and got the deed on that. And it is quite plain that they had the idea of selling it back to the government at an inflated price when the government came to put a lighthouse on it. No proof, but man, the cards all fall that way. But they picked the wrong guy to mess with. They kept bullying, or maybe bribing, the construction foreman. They, when that didn't work, they started organizing petitions to the Congress saying, oh my God, the lighthouse on Outer Island is being placed at the wrong spot. It needs to go at the northern tip, and those fools in the lighthouse service are putting it on the track next door. Something needs to be done, or it's going to be a shipwreck. And as they say, though, they picked the wrong guy to mess with. Like Orlando Poe, Godfrey Weitzel was trained at West Point as a military engineer. Holding the rank of first lieutenant at the outbreak of the Civil War, he rose quickly, becoming brevet brigadier general in 1862 and receiving an extra star to major general in 1864. His military career included serving as chief engineer under Ben Butler in New Orleans, leading troops to victory in engagements at Valladolid and Thibodeau. And then in December of 1864, he was given command of a newly organized, quote-unquote, colored Regiment. Now, on April 3rd, 1865, cavalrymen under his command were the first Union troops to enter the capital city of the Confederacy. As his troops announced to fellow African Americans they encountered, "We have come to set you free," Weitzel sent an equally electrifying telegram to General Ulysses S. Grant. "We entered Richmond at 8 o'clock this morning." After the war, Weitzel resumed service in the Corps of Engineers at the rank of captain. His accomplishments included construction of canals and locks on the Ohio River in Sault Ste. Marie and the Standard Rock Lighthouse in Lake Superior. In March 1873, promoted once again to Major, Weitzel took over supervision of the 11th Lighthouse District from Orlando Poe. Not going to be intimidated, he saw through Knight and Chapman's schemes and was not about to put the government on the hook to buy their land at an inflated price. After strongly worded letters back and forth and several more false starts, Weitzel was upheld. The light was placed at the present location atop the high clay banks at the due north tip of the island. Now, what were the consequences of that decision? Weitzel made a very commendable decision not to allow the government to be swindled. But let's jump ahead into the future and see the ramifications of that little episode. We're going to go exactly a year ahead to a time just before the lighthouse actually went into service. Freshly appointed lighthouse keeper O.K. Hall watched in dismay as northwest gales turned the water of Lake Superior into a hammer of destruction. Wave after wave pummeled the brand new dock at the foot of the outer island cliff. A heavy scow tied alongside bounced like a child's toy in the seething mass of breakers. And then before Hall's eyes, the dock began to break apart, massive timbers swirling in the roaring sea. Soon it was gone, sacrificed to the anger of the greatest and fiercest of lakes. Later, collecting his thoughts for the station logbook, Hall wrote, September 18, 1874. On Saturday, it blowed a living gale from the north and northwest. The sea washed away the dock and ruined the scow that belonged here. This is a very bad coast to land or get away. A dock gone, a boat ruined, and the lighthouse had not even entered service yet. It was not until October 20th, more than a month after the dock washed away, that Keeper Hall finally lit the lighthouse lamp for its first night of service. The greenhorn keeper broke a lamp chimney in the process. In the intervening time, work crews hastily replaced the dock and put finishing touches on the light tower and fog signal building. Unlike the lighthouse, which stood high and proud above the lake, the signal house cowered at the base of the cliff. You can kind of get an idea where it was from this picture much later. Foghorns of those days were steam-powered, and plenty of water was needed for the boilers. With construction complete, Hall was left alone on the island with his assistant and their families. Problems assailed the hapless keeper immediately. Little more than a month after losing the first dock, its replacement followed. In Hall's words, October 26, 1874, a heavy gale from the northeast with rain. At 5 o'clock, the gale increases with fury. The dock has all washed away. The sea was very angry. Worse was yet to come. Stormy weather continued with such intense winds that the next day, Hall felt the brick tower shake beneath his feet. The day after that, the clay bank began to cave in perilously close to the fog signal building. The keeper reported that water now swirled no more than 8 feet from its walls. 2 weeks of respite followed, but on November 14th, Lake Superior struck the worst blow yet. With snow falling, Hall and his assistant John Drulard began sounding the foghorn in mid-afternoon. At 6 p.m., however, they heard the roar of the bank crashing down around them, burying the building nearly to its roof. We thought the whole side was caving in, Hall wrote. They doused the boilers and fled outside, where the men found that the stairway that once led up the bluff lay smashed at its base. Their only route to shelter came by scrambling willy-nilly up the clay bank as the blizzard swirled around them. And that was the end of Outer Island's first fog signal building after less than a month of operation. In February, a 4-man crew arrived from Detroit, trudging their way across the ice to help Hall and Drouillard remove the boiler and other equipment from the rubble. Well, erosion has been a problem at Outer Island ever since. In 2002, the National Park Service received funding from Congress to fix things up. Do it right this time. Were we successful? Our grandkids will be able to tell us. Oh, and just as an aside, Hall and Drouillard spent the whole winter out there together. That was kind of unusual, and eventually what happened was with the lighthouses would close at the end of the navigation season, and everybody would come off for the winter and return as the lake was opening up. But in those first few years at Outer Island, the keepers stayed out there all year round. That didn't work out so well, especially that first year. Mr. Hall and Mr. Drouillard really got on each other's nerves. And by the time spring came around, they weren't even talking to another. They were living at opposite ends of the house and not speaking, except, as Hall wrote, except in terms the foulest abuse you can imagine. Neither of them belonged in their job, and they were both fired the following year. Now, talking about people who really were in the wrong job and probably didn't belong in a lighthouse, let's go back to our friend Francis Yacker. He's back on, I have one more story to tell, by the way, but I want to just wrap things up with Francis. He's one of the most fascinating characters in all of the Apostle Islands. Scholar, an artist. Okay, that's a self-portrait he did. Okay, on a fungus, on a bracket fungus about this big. That was one of his crafts. He would collect fungus in the forest. That's a miniature. It's no more than about 4 inches high. He composed hymns on a guitar. He, as they say, became fluent in Ojibwe. He was born in Germany, went to university there, and spoke fluent German, collected Ojibwe legends, and wrote about Ojibwe culture in articles that were published in German anthropological journals. I mean, the guy was a Renaissance man, but he was not much of a lighthouse keeper. But everything's hunky-dory now, right? He's back in the lighthouse, he's had something to eat, he's got dry clothes on, he's got, a pipe full of tobacco, and he's thinking about, man, I owe the old lady big time on this one. Well, no, there's a complication. Because you see, one of those nights that he was on Oak Island, and the light had long since burned out at the lighthouse, the ship went by and noticed there was no light shining in the Raspberry Island lighthouse. And of course, letting the lamp go out was the absolute worst offense a lighthouse keeper could commit. Definitely a firing offense, if ever there was one. And the ship's captain, when he finally got to port, sent a telegram to the Lighthouse Service District Office in Detroit, reporting the fact that the lighthouse was out during a storm, and what the hell was going on? I could have wrecked my ship, and it would have been your fault. So the inspector immediately wires back to Yacker saying, explain yourself. And Yacker says, hey, remember that time I told you I needed some help out here? And that there was an emergency, there was nobody around to help me? Well, let me tell you about that. And so sure enough, that all went back and forth in the wheels of the bureaucracy, and it made its way back to the actual headquarters of the Lighthouse Service in Washington. And then about 12 years ago, I had a grant to go to the National Archives and spend a couple of weeks going through the records of the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And in there I was able to find that whole set of correspondence from the captain complaining about the light being out to Yocker's explanation, and then on the bottom of that, in pencil, it says, authorize Assistant Keeper Raspberry Island, and it's initialed off by the head of the Lighthouse Service. Looking at that, now that is cool. I mean, that's when historians, think, oh, this is what to live for, is finding something like that. So anyway, yeah, Francis, things worked out. The next year, his oldest son comes, and then in the September of 1890, 4 years almost to the day, wrecks another boat under almost identical circumstances. And you know how he was so desperate to have an assistant? Well, inexplicably, you look through the logbook, and his son was gone for almost the entire month of September, whether he was still collecting his paycheck or on vacation or not. I mean, the guy was totally irresponsible, but at least this time, rather than trying to save the boat, he just sat there and watched it be battered into smithereens. Says, I ain't going out there again. Did they fire him that time? No. They gave him a job at a lighthouse much closer to home. Francis Yocker, despite his best efforts, lived to a ripe old age. He died in 1923. And how do we know all this? Well, among other things, besides the records of the Lighthouse Service, as I mentioned, he was quite the writer. And his diary turned up in an antique store in Marquette, Michigan in 1952, sold for 15 cents. It says it's pencil, and it's now in the rare book collection at the University of Michigan. And so we have his first-hand account of this and a lot of other things that went on. Absolutely fascinating character. If I could pick one person from the history of the Apostle Islands to sit down and talk with for an hour, it would be him. And if I had to pick one person to never go out in a boat with, it would also be him. All right. I want to tell one last story and bring us up much closer to the present, because history is still being made in and around the Apostle Islands. You look out across the lake, trees are in the way, but you can actually see the Ashland Breakwater Lighthouse, which last year was added to the collection that was already called the nation's finest collection of lighthouses. And therein lies another tale if we drop back a little farther. On July 11th, 2015, the National Park Service celebrated the addition of the Ashland Breakwater Lighthouse to the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. Thanks to a bipartisan effort by the area's Republican congressman and Democratic senator, the park boundaries were redrawn ever so slightly to take in the 100-year-old tower, and ownership of the structure transferred from the U.S. Coast Guard to the NPS. It was quite the occasion. There was live music, free food and drink for the crowd, and speeches by politicians and officials congratulating each other for the achievement. The last time the National Park Service added to their stock of Apostle Islands lighthouses, the event was considerably quieter. So quiet, in fact, that the National Park Service missed it entirely. Incredibly, the agency spent nearly 4 years unaware of the fact that an act of Congress had given the park ownership of not one, but a whole sled load of lighthouses. As hard as it is to understand, it seems the managers of the National Lakeshore never even heard the pitter-patter of reindeer hooves on their roof. When the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore was established in 1970, the park boundaries incorporated 5 light stations, making up the major portion of what has come to be known as the largest and finest single collection of lighthouses in the country. However, ownership of the buildings did not always come along with title to the land underneath them. For the first 2 decades of the park's existence, management and preservation of the lighthouses took place under a hodgepodge of agreements between the NPS and the Coast Guard. Complicating life was the well-known fact that the 2 agencies did not always see eye to eye on issues of historic preservation. By 1986, the two agencies had settled into a workable, if somewhat tense, modus vivendi way of living, whose precise arrangements were different at each of the 5 island light stations. It gets a little complicated because the history of the ownership of each of the lighthouses was a little different. You know, some of them went directly to the Coast Guard, others had been in private hands for a while. So there was a separate agreement in place for each one of the light stations, and some of them worked well, some of them did not. And in one particular case, it blew up got to be pretty ugly. The situation at Devil's Island was not nearly so amicable, and at the close of the park's second decade, the two agencies came into open conflict over the Coast Guard's unilateral decision to remove the tower's third-order lens. Whoops, let me get back up here. Whoop, all right, no. To remove the tower's third-order lens, the last lens remaining in an Apostle Island's light for, quote, safekeeping in a Michigan warehouse. Before that happened, though, a new law changed the rules of the game. In 1986, the U.S. Congress added an additional island to the 20 that made up the national park, the skinny sandbar known as Long Island. Separating Chequamegon Bay from the open lake, Long Island was the site of not one, but 3 lighthouses over the years. The archipelago's second oldest beacon was built there in 1858, and then replaced in the 1890s by 2 towers, the Chequamegon Point light at the island's tip, and the larger Nula Point light nearly a mile to the east. Incorporating Long Island into the boundaries only added 200 acres to the national lakeshore, but the language of the bill contained a hidden bombshell. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, any federal property located within the boundaries of the lakeshore is hereby transferred to the administrative jurisdiction of the Secretary of the Interior for the purposes of the lakeshore, provided, however, that the United States Coast Guard may retain a right to utilize a portion of such land and facilities as navigational aids so long as may be. Translating that into English, from that point on, the Coast Guard would be nothing more than a tenant in lighthouses belonging to the National Park Service. The change sailed right over park managers' heads, who remained oblivious to the new acquisitions. A copy of the Long Island Bill in the National Lakeshore Files at Bayfield bears a penciled notation. This passage came to our attention 5/24/1990, 4 years after it was passed. The way that finally happened might be even more embarrassing to the agency. Though NPS officials objected to the planned removal of the Devil's Island lens, they offered only a muted response, believing they had little say in the matter. A group of local citizens stepped into the breach and filed a lawsuit to prevent the move. In August 8, 1989, though the court had yet to rule on the case, Coast Guard crews confidently, some said arrogantly, went ahead and dismantled the lens, dropping some prisms in the process, crated up the pieces, and shipped them off to Michigan. And there's my picture of the lens headed out of order. The custody dispute grew even more heated. The citizen plaintiffs gained the support of national preservation groups and the local congressman. But the NPS continued to tread lightly. One former staff member who was involved in the deliberations and spoke on condition of anonymity reported that Park Superintendent Jerry Banta was hesitant to take a strong stand on the lens issue because he feared antagonizing the Coast Guard would interfere with long-term hopes of getting the lighthouses transferred to NPS ownership. It took a Coast Guard official to tell him he needn't have worried. According to a second park staffer, long retired, the news came at the beginning of a tense meeting between representatives of the two agencies. We were getting ready to do battle over the Devil's Island lens, he recalled, when one of the Coast Guard lawyers dropped the bomb. Basically, haven't you guys heard? You already own them. None of the NPS personnel interviewed years later could explain just how it happened that the agency managed to overlook what seemed to be a very straightforward provision of the bill, and more than one admitted that the affair was painful to recall. Over the years that followed, the NPS and the Coast Guard maintained a fairly even relationship at the Apostle Islands, plagued by occasional lapses in communication. The issue of the Devil's Island lens was eventually resolved by a court ruling that the Coast Guard had indeed overstepped its authority. A National Park Service technician spent several weeks repairing damage incurred when Coast Guardsmen dismantled the lens, and on August 31st, park workers returned the optic to the tower, where it remains to this day. And it was my first year at the Apostles. I took that picture. I was down at the bottom, handling the ropes at the bottom, trying to keep them from getting tangled as we raised all the pieces back up. In the end, the oversight had little impact on the historic structures. Both agencies had continued maintaining them in accordance with their previous agreements. So what, it seemed, if one party knew something that the other did not? Still, there seems a lesson to be learned. Every now and then, we should all check to make sure that no one's given us a lighthouse when we weren't paying attention. Now, I had already planned on telling this particular story tonight when I got some news that I found particularly gratifying. I mentioned the fact that the real heroes of this story were not necessarily my colleagues in the National Park Service or anybody else, but rather 3 local citizens who said, enough is enough, we're not going to put up with this anymore, and stood up to the federal government and the Coast Guard, filed a lawsuit, and would not let the subject drop. And those 3 citizen activists are names that are familiar to all of us. There's Janet Bewley, who's now our state senator. There's Warren Nelson, who we all know from the Chautauqua. And right at the front, spearheading the charge, was none other than our own Betty Ferris. Betty, come on up! Come on! All right, you don't have to come up if you don't want to, but I just want to say that the kind of citizen activism that was shown by the people who would not let the Devil's End issue drop, I think is a model for all of us, and it's kind of one of the examples that I looked toward 10 years ago when, after retiring from the Park Service, I said there's a way to continue this kind of activism, that I can do it with my friends in founding the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy. And I thank you folks for coming out. I thank the Historic Society and the Heritage Association for inviting me. I very much thank Betty Ferris. Yes, please come up. Tell us your stuff. Tell us. Did I leave anything out?
I only have like 20 to 30 minutes. You don't need to worry.
Actually, the only thing I want to say, and I want to make this very from my heart. We lived in a time in 1989 where we actually had the rule of law. We had law. We had administrative rules. We could believe in them. They were there for us to use. That is how we saved the Devil's Island lens. Now we have just a bunch of barbarians who are in charge of our, everything. And the rule of law would not work for us today. And I just implore everyone to understand that we used to have rights as citizens. I could file a lawsuit. If you look at it, it says Ferris versus the U.S. Department of the Treasury. I used to be able to do that as a citizen. I can't do that now. Remember that.
that's what history's about. So thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you for pressing everybody. Well, I think every one of us is aware that the nation is at a turning point.
Yes,
Let's hope the good guys win.
that's right.
And I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Barry. Now, we got some incredible music coming up, right?
And wonderful.
And wonderful food. Let's have it. Thank you again, folks.